Welcome to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham, coming at you today nearly live. We are in Ottawa, Ontario, at the City of Ottawa Archives, a beautiful brand new building, well, about 6 years old now, with the City of Ottawa archivist, Paul Henry. Paul, welcome to the show.
Good morning.
We're here to talk about a story that has sort of just been resolved in a way. For people who don't know, in 2014, the City of Ottawa, as they are building their LRT underground tunnel, found some human remains, and they were from the Barrack City Cemetery from the 19th century. And when you find human remains in any sort of construction project, obviously that leads to a lot of discussion, what to do, how do you proceed, and eventually it gets to you in the city archive. So we've talked just off before we started recording about some of the processes that you use here. But I'm curious, for you as a historian, as an archivist who's been in the city a long time, you in 2014, do you remember when you heard that the construction crews had found these remains? And do you remember what your initial thought was, knowing that eventually I'm sure you would have work to do associated with that?
Actually, there have been three finds. In fact, there was two in 2013 and then the final one in 2015. And over that period, as the information came up through the media with respect to the find, we knew, and of course we had indirectly as a research site, we had individuals from the various teams who were here doing research, so we knew that this was going to be a big thing. When you find human remains on a site, and my colleagues at the archaeological team who did the initial site investigation, one of the first things you have to make sure is that you're not dealing with a criminal offense. Yeah. So one of the first things they had was the Ottawa police were in doing their very capable work, their forensic teams in determining that this wasn't just a mass murder site. And it became obvious at a later point through that process that they were actually dealing with an historic burial. And then the research by the archaeological team that was contracted through the LRT group identified as being part of the Barrack Hill Cemetery. And if I can go back and give just a brief capsule summary of Ottawa history just for your listeners. Bytown, as it was called, was founded in about 1826. The earliest settlers that we had in this area, mostly on the other side of the river in what is now modern-day Gatineau or modern-day Hull, came around 1800. And a lot of settlement occurred after the War of 1812, as you can imagine. After the land was initially surveyed in the 1790s, but most of this area around here was swamp, actually.
Right. Yeah.
And that plays a role in the story as we begin to look at how people died. But it gained strategic importance after the War of 1812, and it was decided that the St. Lawrence Seaway that went from Kingston to Montreal was too close to the American border, straddled the American border, and so it was thought strategically that there should be a different avenue to get from Kingston to Montreal. So they decided to build the Rideau Canal, and Lieutenant Colonel John By, who was the Royal Engineer assigned the task, was essentially the founder of Bytown, and he established they established in 1826. They began the project of building the Rideau Canal. They didn't finish until about 1832 or so. It took a long time, a lot of effort, a lot of engineering work was done that is still in existence today. If you go to the lock system, a lot of the original lock design, in fact, most of the original lock design is still in daily use, but it's not snowing. And By established in about 1827 a cemetery just below Barrack Hill. And there were two settlements at the time. One in Lowertown, which is the Byward Market area, the area near the Chateau Laurier and the Byward Market area, and then the Uppertown piece, which was more towards what would now be Centertown. And the cemetery was in the middle, and there was a pathway that sort of wended its way around and through, and to some degree, through the cemetery. But the cemetery was bordered, on the south by a swamp, and on the north, essentially, by what is now Parliament Hill, or what was then ordnance land, owned and managed by the British Crown, where by had all of the barracks, giving it its name. All the soldiers who were here were barracked at Barrack Hill.
And that's one of those things that's really interesting, just the changing of space, right? Because right now, or where they found the remains, was right under Queen Street. So what's on Queen Street? You have the CBC is there. You have a bunch of government buildings, some private offices as well. Like it has nothing resembling a cemetery. And what's interesting to me, in part, about this story is that transformation of space. Yes. That in not that much time, right? It's only 150, 60 years from cemetery to now. They're building a tunnel for a light rail transit system under there. So I'm curious, after these remains are found, they go through the archaeological process, and then after everything is agreed as to what to do and how to proceed, it comes to you and the city archives to help determine who these people were, how they died maybe, and what information we can find about them. So the first question I have about that, though, is what was the process in doing this research from that land going from cemetery to urban space, given that cemeteries, we like to believe, are sacrosanct, and they're a place where, you know, when cemeteries market themselves, they say, you're here for eternity and this is your final resting place. Clearly for these people, that's not true. And clearly that space of the cemetery was changed over time. And I'm just curious, in researching that process, how does that happen?
Well, the process of that we know today in terms of funerary practices is a Victorian practice. It's a late 19th century. So in the early 19th century, this was not the case. As the city expanded, the cemetery, it became necessary to encroach on the cemetery for a variety of reasons. The land was originally expropriated from Nicholas Sparks, after whom Spark Street is named. He regained those lands. They were given back to him in the 1840s. It was at that point that the cemetery was actually moved. And you have to think in this early pre-Victorian or early Victorian period that the idea of a permanent sacrosanct cemetery was something a bit of flux. So when the remains were found, they were actually sent to the Museum of History for forensic analysis. So they did an examination of the bones, and they wanted to know the sex, whether they could tell what kind of work the individual did, what their diet was like, and try to see if they could find out how people died, which would be interesting to help them both date the remains, but also to, as an archaeological process, to do some anthropological and archaeological investigation. From our side, there had been some research that's necessary under the Cemeteries Act that was done by the archaeology group in terms of preparing the site disposition agreement to determine exactly what was going to happen. The city at that point, fairly clear that this was a definite civic responsibility to manage these remains that had been found in projects that were under the responsibility of the city, both for LRT as well as for some utility work which had been ongoing as under Queen Street as part of the Queen Street revitalization. And you'll note,
which has been happening for 40 years, it seems.
Right.
Like.
And this, the city building is a thing of flux. It's not what we see now as modern urban planning is not how they planned cities in the old days. So you can imagine, and in fact, when we looked in the records, and one of my staff went nearly blind looking at old microfilm of the Bytown Gazette for 10 years of old microfilm, to see if we could find any evidence that there was a public notification that the cemetery would move. The inhabitants were based on parish registers, Presbyterian, Roman Catholic, and Anglican, which essentially makes them British in origin, Irish, Scottish, and English, which makes sense in terms of the settlement patterns for the area. There were some Methodists in there towards the end. And what we can surmise is that the move was probably informally done through the various parishes and congregations. It was not something that was officially managed. And in fact, the cemetery moved twice. There was a cemetery off Rideau Street, which is now near where McDonald Gardens is, McDonald Gardens Park, near the Cummings Bridge on Rideau Street. That's where the three cemeteries moved to. And they then later moved in the 1870s to Beechwood and to Notre Dame cemeteries, which had been established later on.
Right.
There was another cemetery around Rideau and Scott Street, which was Roman Catholic as well. So we have the old cemetery, the new cemetery, and the new cemetery, as you can imagine. So it was a constant process as the city evolved, and really it's that evolution that dictates where we bury our dead. Yeah. What we could find from the newspaper reports, however, was that in an age before embalming, what they called floating vapors, the smell of the decomposition of the dead, essentially, was disturbing people living nearby the cemetery. The second problem is that given, and you've experienced the lovely wet winters we have here in Ottawa, down to minus 50 with a wind chill, you have a very, very deep frost line. And so when you bury bodies in shallow graves during times of epidemics, what happens is the frost actually pushes the bodies to the surface. So there were bodies that were unburying themselves at the same time, which was, again, disturbing.
It's a nice treat in the spring when the snow melts.
That's right. That's right. Consequently, there was a growing public demand for the move of the cemetery, which happened in the 1840s.
Right.
And then following Nicholas Sparks's reacquisition of his lands, they laid down streets. And we have, again, from the early records, primary records, newspaper records and diaries and so on, we have evidence that there was disturbances. So we have in newspaper records of children playing with skulls that they found as late as the late 19th century. And bodies being found continuously. And as you can imagine, and I can certainly show you some of our early planning documents that we have here in the archives, you can see all the sewer records and the road records. And by in two phases in 1903 and 1907, there was significant revitalization. So all of the sewer systems that you hear in recent years that we've replaced 100-year-old sewer, well, that puts the time period when the sewer was originally laid out in 1903, 1907. Yeah. So you get a real sense that the city was building, that it was modernizing, that it was beginning to industrialize at the same time. Yeah. We didn't have running water at that point. We didn't have, certainly didn't have penicillin. We didn't have even modern fire suppression. And in fact, the early waterworks that we have were designed as part of fire suppression, not as part of distribution of clean water. And we didn't have clean water. We didn't have water treatment plants until after the 1918 influenza outbreak in 1918.
When you say move cemeteries, though, are you talking about just they're taking the area that was called a cemetery and saying, now this is going to be our cemetery, and leaving bodies? Or was it a concentrated effort to take the bodies and the ones that were there that they found then, and maybe across the city when they're doing other projects, those are ones that were left behind by accidents? Like the idea of moving this, I'm just curious what that process
maybe not by accident, by neglect.
Okay.
So the family, members of the congregation or the parish would collect the remains of their ancestors and move them to the new cemetery. The ones that remain behind, we suspect were individuals who had no remaining descendants.
Okay.
So you can imagine two cholera epidemics, one in 1832 and one in 1834, that they had no one
right
to care for them.
Right. And so the people who are left then, that makes your job harder, in essence, if there's no lineage then. If that's largely the reason they were left, then it's hard for you to go through the files and try and figure out who they are.
That's right, and it's an enormous challenge, and this part hasn't been done, and it may eventually be done, but not now. All of the investigation by our colleagues at the Museum of History, the Canadian Museum of History, have heavily documented each set of remains, and that information has been linked to each of the caskets. So as we reinter the remains or we rebury the remains, each container is numbered. So we'll be able to actually link those remains back to the scientific data that may, at some future time when DNA analysis becomes easier, or through happenstance. So if you submit your DNA to Ancestry for
get a hit,
you might automatically be linked up with these remains at some distant period, if ever if ever that's something that becomes ubiquitous across the society. Who knows what will happen? But we've taken steps to ensure that all of the remains are identified, so that the possibility remains that it can be done.
So in the story, when you're trying to find out why that cemetery was there, why it was moved, does that matter in the larger story of these particular remains in terms of trying to figure out what to do with them next? Or, in that larger story, I'm just wondering how the cemetery itself, right, how the Barrack Hill Cemetery helps inform the larger contemporary discussion around how to deal with the remains.
Well, I think that's something, a principle that we engaged in early on in the discussion, in the process, that we agreed that it would be more appropriate for the remains to be reinterred, reburied in a manner befitting both their faith tradition as well as their historical method of burial. So the caskets that have been constructed by the city, and they were done internally within the city, as well as the numbered plates were hand punched actually by a member of my staff.
Oh, wow.
That we did this in accordance, and we actually had someone research 19th century funerary practices to ensure that we were authentic to those original practices, so that we, in paying respect to the remains, that we would do so in a manner that would be appropriate to them and to their faith traditions. This is why we didn't take the step of just having the remains cremated.
Right.
We took the step of merely moving the remains to where they should go.
Does that then help us inform the city too, and I mean the physical space of the city? It's
part of that broad narrative of city building, yes.
Right.
And I think, and I mean, don't be shocked by this, but there are going to be more remains found.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, if you look at Queen Street today, they've stopped the revitalization at Metcalfe. So between Elgin Street and Metcalfe, that work is yet to be done.
Right.
So you can appreciate that there's a sensibility that we may find more remains in that area.
Well, really an expectation then that
yes,
there
absolutely.
will be. Yeah. And I know the Haunted Walk, they start on Spark Street at Elgin, right at the War Memorial there, and they start by saying this used to be a cemetery. That's how they start their tours.
Yes.
And I assume that's help informed by this whole story.
And what's interesting is I think we really, our modern sensibilities, we fail to truly appreciate how far we've come. 1962, in the building of the Greens Creek treatment facility, previous to that we were dumping raw sewage into the Ottawa River.
Yeah.
We're not treating sewage going into the river. So you can imagine that 1962 is 45 or
it's not that long ago.
it's
50
years,
55
years ago, right?
Yeah. It's not that long.
It's not that long ago.
Yeah.
So we've come a long way.
Right.
It's appreciating, and I believe this to be true, especially with respect to the 2017 and the sesquicentennial events and so on, that while we take the opportunity to examine who we are and all that means, and who we would like to be, we are obligated, or I believe as an historian that we're obligated to take a moment to look back,
right,
and see who we once were. And I think that informs, as you say, who we are and who we should be, by virtue of that exploration of who we once were, and how that makes us who we are today, and what we've overcome, and the work that we still have yet to do.
And the use of space is a really important part of that whole story.
Yeah.
That and the idea of this is interesting. And just listening to you talk about Parliament Hill was Barrack Hill, so it was a barrack. So there's weaponry and all that kind of stuff there.
There's ordnance lands.
And then right next to it is where they're burying people. Like, those are two very different emotions that come from those two things. You could say one directly leads to the other, obviously, and so you have them next to each other. But that's an interesting use of space, thinking now what was the cemetery is now largely sort of post-industrial space, right? Offices and towers and all that kind of stuff. And then Parliament Hill is, I know politicians work there, but really for most people it's a tourist site. Right, it's a site to come see something, and it's such an interesting transformation of that space in not that much time, and to think about then the people who live here and who lived here then, who live here now, how they use that space is so radically different that it speaks to perhaps the contemporary society and how it's changed so much.
But as an historian, I have the benefit of looking sort of writ large at the entire progress of humanity and the basically 217 years that Europeans have lived in this area, and even before, in terms of indigenous peoples' relationships to the land and the essentially what is the major highway, which was the Ottawa River, and that would allow indigenous peoples, and before that other settlers to move about the land efficiently from areas, Montreal, and into the Canadian West. So this relationship to land and a growing sensibility in terms of our relationship to that land, I believe is a meaningful journey. If you look at Jacques Hubert, who was the architect of modern Ottawa, architect of the Greenbelt, brought here by Prime Minister King to redesign Ottawa as the Washington of the North, that you see a lot of the signatures of what we would see as trappings of the 1940s and 50s, that sort of transformation period. We call it the transformation period, the immediate post-war period, when Ottawa became more so the nation's capital rather than the city that happened to just have Parliament Hill in it. So the complete removal of LeBreton Flats, which was Ottawa's industrial area. You had Carling Breweries, for example, was there. You had all the rail switching yards. There was a complete removal of rail systems from Ottawa in the 1950s, replaced with what is now the Queensway. A complete removal of rail from downtown, so the what is now the Congress Center. was the old Union Station across from Chateau Laurier, is now a government conference center. And actually, I believe either the House of Commons or the Senate is having their official chambers in that building.
Right, I think it's the Senate. I think it's the Senate,
being renovated for that purpose. But Gribert had a different idea. Gribert wanted to actually have sort of a superhighway that would have been Wellington Street, and there was going to be an underpass that, if you're going, in your fancy car, and you would sort of go into this underpass where the Union Station was, and they were going to tear that down, and you would kind of go in underneath and progress up Sussex Drive as this highway. And that never came to pass, but that was one of Gribert's. There's a beautiful book called Transforming Ottawa, written by one of the planners who works here in the city, and Transforming Ottawa sort of documents in pictures Ottawa pre-Gribert and Ottawa post-Gribert. It's really quite a fascinating read.
Yeah. In seeing how that space is transformed, though, and as you mentioned, there's more bodies there that
we suspect so, yeah.
That will probably be found at some point if they continue with the Queen Street projects. But, I think about even where the War Memorial is and how that is a site for a lot of people, a site to come, for some to grieve, for others to remember. It's very, there's a funerary feel to the Remembrance Day ceremony, I think, every year. And it's sort of, I don't know if it's ironic or just coincidental, that's around the same space where there was this cemetery there as well. Does that, or this idea that now we're taking the remains that were found and reinterring them in a way that, as you say, you try to make it as authentic as possible and respectful to the time. But if there's people who are still there in that space, does the fact that they are in a place that is now a site of remembrance and a site of commemoration, does that somehow mitigate the changing of the space for you? Like, because to me, it almost seems like it's kind of fitting.
Yeah,
in a way.
The area where the War Memorial is, that area was not. That's a constructed area.
Right.
The Russell Hotel was actually in that area, and a very famous hotel in early Ottawa. A lot of very famous people. Oscar Wilde stayed at the Russell Hotel, and a lot of politicians would stay there if they came from their ridings, then they would stay in the Russell Hotel or in rooming houses along Spark Street and so on, when they were not back in their ridings. So it was a very hustle and bustle period once Ottawa was selected as the capital. But at the time when the cemetery was still there, we really didn't even have organized modern democratic government that you would expect today. I mean, the town of Bytown was not created until 1850, after the Baldwin Act of 1849. And in fact, Bytown was still Bytown until 1855, when it was named Ottawa, and then not the nation's capital until 1857. Right. So we're still well before that. But you can see on the horizon, as the local citizens were trying to make Bytown more than what it was at the time, and you can sort of see their vision beginning to take shape. And the vision of the people who shape the land and shape our relationship to each other in terms of the cities and the communities that we build, it's that vision that shapes over time in response to that dynamic of citizen engagement with their land and with their community, and the whole process of the growth of both of the government of Ottawa, both as a seat for federal as well as local politics, that emerges through that period, that dynamic, that interplay between town and crown.
Then how do you present that to the public today? Right, when people read about the story and they see human remains, all this, and how do you convey that to the general public in Ottawa? Because that would fall to sort of everyone involved in this story, with the Canadian Museum of History and the archaeologists involved, but certainly to you as well. And I'm sure you've gotten emails from people and the people who come in to use the archives here and say, how is it possible that we built over a cemetery? And I mean, it's all well and good to talk about the changing of space and all that, but I think for a lot of people, they would just see this cemetery sacrosanct, done, and sort of it's a cut and dry issue. So to a certain extent, it falls to you to help explain how this happens.
We create persons of the past at our own peril. We are forever pushing our own sensibilities onto the past, and there are instances where we find parts of the past intolerable. In some instances, there has been a call to not to celebrate certain things, or to take monuments down, and this is happening in the United States now, and that's a very natural growth from people's connection to the past, right? What's key, though, in that process, and the archives is really your embodiment. Where authenticity starts here. We are where you will find the actual authentic and reliable record. I didn't say the true record.
Right,
I'll explain what I mean by that. That you, as a contemporary person, create records to document your actions and your activities that speak to what you believe to be true at the time. Mm-hmm. And at a future point, we will have a different set of beliefs about an historical event. And so the contemporary records help inform how we understand how people lived through an historical event. They may not be true in a modern sense, in our modern context, but at the time, this is really how people believed, and it's critical to make those records available so people understand how we acted and believed. I mean, the whole modern funerary practice with funeral homes looking after the remains as a sacrosanct place and a forever place is a modern Victorian era. The relationship between people and the dead was very much a family affair in the early 19th century. So if you passed away, the family would make your coffin. They would make the pall, which is the cloth that would cover and be used to carry your coffin. Mm-hmm. The wake, if one was held in the home. You would be carried to the burial ground by members of your family and your close friends. It's a lot different than the industry that has grown up around death today. And so understanding this is very much part of the mission of historians and the mission of people, archivists, and people who use historical records. So reporters, bloggers, amateur historians, genealogists, students, and anyone who's interested in the history of their neighborhood and how they came to be. I believe, as an historian, that we cannot become better who we are if we don't understand where we came from. Right. And having access to those records and having the comprehensive story that helps us say, well, we used to have a cemetery in the middle of the city, but now it's rows and rows of modern office buildings. Yeah. And this came about because of this and this and this and this and this. So that's why we don't do that anymore.
Right. Now, all that being said, the city did have last week an event where they allowed people to come pay their respect to the remains that were found.
Yes.
Given the push towards authenticity that you talked about, and the idea of the modern funeral practices and the Victorian and post-Victorian ideas of that, is the idea of a public event, or public event makes it sound like it was a festival or something, but the opportunity for the public to come pay respects, does that not somehow go against the push to authenticity that you just talked about?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it was a public visitation in the sense of a traditional wake, and really these are unknown citizens of Ottawa, and they belong to all of us. So they very much are our friends and neighbors and relatives as much as they are unknown souls from the past. And so in the traditional wake of the early 19th century, this is an opportunity for people visit, and the Museum of History for the last several years has been their home.
Right.
So really, we brought them. We could have had the public visitation at Beechwood Cemetery. We chose not to.
And then there's an event upcoming, which will be in the past once this gets posted, but
yes,
upcoming on Sunday for the reinterment.
Yes. And
that process is not open to the public.
No.
And how was that decision made?
Well, we found, there's, if you can imagine, in terms of the burial of 52 caskets, that grave side is basically an open grave where all of the caskets will be arrayed. And from a safety perspective, we didn't want to have a lot of people from the public there. So we wanted to provide an opportunity for the public to pay their respects, and that's why we chose to have the public visitation separate from the service. And there will be representatives of the three religious traditions that will preside over the service, and there will be an opportunity of civic representatives to stand in situ for the family. And again, it's all about, I call it a dignity deficit, to render to the souls of the past the dignity that has been denied them the last 170 years of their death.
In terms of what happened on top of their remains?
What happened on top of their final resting place. And so we are correcting that deficit.
Personally, for you, as someone who, as you said, you're a historian, you've been in the city a long time. You started your career at the National Archives, as they were known. Now you're here as the city archivist for Ottawa. Obviously, you have a connection to the city. It's apparent from just talking to you for the past hour or however long I've been here. I'm wondering if this experience going through this process, since the remains were found, since it came to you and your process in it, if it's changed your relationship with the city, and if, say, when you ride the LRT, when it opens, which we hope it all opens very soon, as you're going underneath downtown in that tunnel, if you'll sort of reflect on this whole experience, and if that does have a lasting effect for you in the city.
Yeah, I have the benefit as an archivist as well as constantly living in a meta world where I'm not only aware of the passage of historic time and significant historic events happening around me, but I have a professional detachment that I can engage, right, that allows me to reflect on that meta level of how in the world am I going to document this in an effective and meaningful way so that future historians and future city planners and builders and visionaries and dreamers who dream of the city in a different way than we see it today, how can I inform those discussions? But history to me is something that is alive all around us in terms of our own personal and professional lives, but in our communities and our neighborhoods. And I think just seeing the reaction, we had several hundred people come to the visitation on the weekend, this past weekend, and I think that for me, that was very meaningful to see and gratifying to see the response of people who live in Ottawa today, that they understood what the city was trying to do with that visitation, and that they appreciated it. And it's that connection to land, that connection to community, that connection to neighborhood that I am constantly reflecting on as we try and my staff here at the archives, when we try to develop our own planning mechanisms for how we document the city's history and how we document the interaction between citizens and their government, and how we capture the best evidence that will help us allow researchers of the present and future to investigate their past.
Right. And yeah, that's sort of that meta part of it, because in 100 years, somebody might say, hey, why are these 52 caskets here and all that? And then they'll come and look at the archives that you're leaving as to why they're there.
And we'll have all the records.
Yeah. As we said, the ceremony is October the 1st, which is the past. It's the future when we're talking right now. The past when you're listening to this. The public visitation was September 24th. And if you Google this story, you can find a bunch of news reports on it. And visit the City of Ottawa Archives website, and you can see some of the files that were used in terms of what's available here. And if you want to come check out some of the material, I know, Paul, you and your staff are more than happy to help people out when they come on down. Because we were talking before, this is a new facility, and for those people who have done research in Ottawa, which I know is a lot of our audience, this facility is better equipped in a lot of ways than another facility in Ottawa, especially in things like turnaround time and responsiveness. So, and I know it's something that you're quite proud of, and you're very happy to be in this building. So,
yeah, it's we're very. We still pinch ourselves. We have our Ottawa's first. We just celebrated our 40th anniversary last year as a institution, the archives. And this is our first purpose-built facility designed with labs and with vaults and environmental controls and emergency power systems and a beautiful public reference room that has developed to help serve researchers. And I have a fantastic team here who is happy to assist researchers in understanding not only the records that they're looking at, but where the records came from, which is a fundamental contribution that archivists make. And even if I look at the growth and development of the archives, as well as, again, talking about meta growth, we designed this facility in 2007, and at the time we had laid out 10 computer workstations with personal public use computers that we would have available for people to look at our databases. And then in 2010, Steve Jobs invented the iPad. And so now we have 2 public use computers, and the 10 computer workstations have been replaced by couches and chairs, and an opportunity for people to use the city archives not only as a research facility, but as a place of reflection. We have some display cases so they can not only reflect but also experience firsthand some of the treasures and artifacts that we have in the collection that we have on display.
Yeah, and it seems like the building is sort of designed almost for that purpose. Like walking around, and I noticed your window here, and I noticed on the stairs as well, a lot of the glassware or the glass window stuff has text on it.
Yes.
And it looks sort of on your window here, handwritten text that you would see in an archival document. So it's a whole experience that's clearly that you're stepping into a place that is representative of the past, or as a trove of information.
Yeah, the architects call this physicality of space.
Right.
So the space itself is designed to represent what it holds.
Right.
And you'll notice I have no leather patches on my tweed jacket. I'm wearing an actual suit as opposed to an old style professorial jacket. We're not meeting in a dusty basement, surrounded by red rot and dust. We're in a beautiful modern space with lots of glass and light. And this was very, very important to the design team in designing this space, that we fundamentally believe that the archives, in the true spirit of public archives, belongs to the people of Ottawa and to Canadians writ large. And so the space is designed to be a welcoming, accommodating space where people can come and interact directly with their history and talk to specialists who can help them understand it. And the space is designed to create that welcoming, engaging space that isn't the bastion of pure academic research where the barrier is a PhD. If you don't have one, you can't see it. We're turning that old school notion of what archives are on its head. And my youngest researcher is a 12-year-old who comes here with her mother. She's homeschooled. So she does all her assignments here at the archives.
Oh, cool. Nice.
And some of my researchers my oldest researchers are in their 70s and 80s, and I've got everybody from 12 to 90 coming here to the archives to interact with the documents and the staff. Yeah.
And yeah, wonderful facility. And if you're coming to Ottawa, it's out in Nepean. It's right, I'd say, south of Algonquin College.
Yes, about 2 blocks south.
Yeah, so it's not I joke. I have a friend who lives just actually up the street from here, and I joke that he lives in the middle of nowhere. But of course, it's not true. It's really easy to get out here on the bus, or I got here from downtown, even on a bad traffic day, in 15 minutes. It's really
and LRT by the end of phase 2 LRT.
It would be out here. Yeah,
service just right over here, and in fact the grass. That's area just out in front of the building is actually a reserved transit land.
Perfect.
So grade separated transit way was originally planned for this building. So if you go out and stand at the corner of Tallwood and Woodruff and you look straight up, you can see this reserved space goes all the way to the college where Baseline Station is.
Right.
And the whole space goes all the way down here to Norris. As a grade separated rapid transit system, so we're very connected, and we are geographically centered. We're not in downtown, admittedly, but we're the geographical center of Ottawa, and so
that's because the city decided to take over, all the way to Canada and damn near Renfrew.
Yeah, well, we've actually, I mean, it was I think it was an amalgamation more than it was. In the old days, we used to call them annexations, which was when we literally took over. But in this particular instance, it was a coming together of equal partners in the process.
Yeah. So if you're in Ottawa, come on to the geographic center of the city and visit Paul and his staff here at the City Archives. So that is Paul Henry, the City Archivist for Ottawa. Thank you very much for the time this morning.
It's been a pleasure.
If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, historyslam@gmail.com, Twitter @Dr. Shawnee Fever, and if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.